What's up, everybody? Corey Hughes, Bloody History. So, on the last episode, we went through information involving Alina Garro de Paz and touching a little bit on Sylvia Duran, who was working at the embassy allegedly when Oswald was there, but according to Miss Garro de Paz, Oswald was seen at a party at times that corresponded with Kerry Thornley's known trips to Mexico City. Also, it is alleged that Oswald was having some sort of an affair with Sylvia Duran. Obviously not Oswald. Oswald never went to Mexico City. Kerry Thornley went to Mexico City, and when did he go? He went as he left. This is so good. Like, to me, this is such obvious evidence against Thornley for his involvement in the activities of Oswald during this time period. But when he allegedly leaves from New Orleans in May of 1963 and goes to Whittier, California. On his way, he stops in Mexico City. Right? This is like all confirmed, part of the record. What he was doing there, he doesn't ever say. But then he heads to Whittier, California. Then allegedly, he's gone, okay, till September. So you have May, you get June, July, August, 4 months, right? Or even 3.5 months if it was like the middle of May, right? So let's say between 3 and 4 months, he's just allegedly gone and he's working at some restaurant out there. And that's it. That's all we know. That's all we know. Kerry Thornley has an alibi for 3 or 4 months because he worked at a restaurant in Whittier, California. He actually worked at 2 restaurants. He worked at one in Whittier, and then he worked at another restaurant in a place that was like south of Whittier. I forget what place. I forget what that town was called, but if you're interested in the Kerry Thornley stuff, you can go back and listen to I gotta have 25 episodes on Kerry Thornley that we've done on this show. So you can go back and sort through them, and I'm sure I mentioned that in one of them. But Thornley is most certainly the person who was mistaken for Oswald down in Mexico City. Unquestionably, and to me, the alleged presence of Oswald at a party coinciding with times that Kerry Thornley was there in early September. Because remember, he goes back to New Orleans on September 4th, and he stops in Mexico City on the way, right? So he's there in early September, 3 weeks before Oswald allegedly goes to Mexico City on September the 26th, when he arrives at September 27th at 10 o'clock in the morning and then checks into the hotel. Right? There's so much contradictory information over Mexico City, and so many things that don't jive with the person that we know as Lee Harvey Oswald. So, but we discuss all that, and the person at the center of it all, an assistant to Win Scott, an agent under Win Scott, who worked in the Mexico City office, named Ann Goodpasture. So today we're going to go over Ann Goodpasture's testimony for the HSCA subcommittee on assassinations. And it'll be Mr. Goldsmith talking to Miss Goodpasture. So Mr. Goldsmith says, Miss Goodpasture, I'm going to state for the record that this is in continuation of a hearing that was conducted on April 13th, 1978. We are taking testimony today in the form of a deposition instead of at a formal congressional hearing. My name is Michael Goldsmith, and pursuant to the House Resolution 222, I'm authorized to take your statement under oath today. Before I take your statement concerning the various questions the committee has of you, let me take care of some procedural matters. Are you here voluntarily and without subpoena? Yes. Have you received a copy of the committee rules and supporting resolutions? Yes. Have you had a chance to read rule number 4? Let me check in. I looked over this quickly. Yes. Do you understand rule number 4? I think so. Do you understand that you have a right to counsel? Yes. Do you waive that right today? I don't think so. By waiving that right, I mean, do you give up your right to have counsel present with you at this hearing? Yes. So you don't want an attorney here today, do you? I do not have an attorney. The question is, do you want an attorney here today? No. Fine. If at any point you should want an attorney present, if you would just tell us that and we would stop the deposition, do you understand? Yes. So what I'm gathering is she spoke at a different type of hearing before, which I'll have to dig up because I didn't see. What, do I have that? No, the two that I have, the two other interviews of her that I have are from 1995. So I will have to dig up the first. It's not really a first part. If I'm not mistaken, it was another interview, or a separate another interview of her prior to this one. So, Mr. Goldsmith then says, now under committee rules, you have a right to receive a copy of the statement you give us at a deposition. I'm going to ask you give up that right to receive a copy of your statement, and let me explain to you why. If you were appearing before the committee at executive session as you did in April. Okay, so it's an April executive session. If you guys could find that for me, I'd really appreciate that. The executive session interview of Ann Goodpasture from April of 78. The committee rules do not provide for you to receive actually in your possession the transcript from the hearings. As a matter of convenience to you, and also because of the committee's relationship with the agency, we are taking this statement in the form of a deposition. The agency has requested us to ask its present and former employees to give up the right that they have under the committee rules to receive a copy of the transcript because there was classified information in the transcript. And for you to have the transcript in your personal possession would be contrary to security interests. Now, I want to make it very clear, though, that even though we are asking you to give up your right to receive a copy of the transcript, you are not giving up your right to get access to the transcript. In other words, you have the right to read it, and we can arrange for that at any time. We're simply asking to give up your right to receive a copy of it. Do you understand? Yes. May I ask you something? Mr. Goldsmith says, certainly. And Ms. Goodpasture says, can the agency receive a copy of the transcript, the Inspector General's office, so that they would know in case I make a statement which is not true based on faulty memory? If there is no objection to the committee, I would like for some responsible person in the agency to know what my testimony is so that they could check to see whether my memory is faulty. Oh, Miss Goodpasture, you can rest assured the agency will be all up in your testimony. It's so funny. Mr. Goldsmith says, I understand. And Miss Goodpasture says, but I don't know. I just wanted to raise that question. And then he says the committee rules do not provide for the witness's testimony to be made available to a third person, such as the agency. The agency, if it is interested in receiving a copy of your testimony, would ask the committee, and the committee would then take a vote on whether or not your testimony should be released. Now, by you indicating on the record that you prefer for the agency to have access to the material, the benefactor would have an effect on the committee's vote. I should also add that if the committee ultimately depends to some extent upon your testimony and uses that testimony to make a finding of fact, we would, as a matter of routine, tell the agency in advance, and if the agency has a problem with that, they can get back to us. Ms. Goodpasture says, I am just concerned that some of my testimony may be in conflict with records. I understand. Through faulty memory. Oh, of course, faulty memory. In any event, do you give up your right to receive a copy of the transcript? I don't need a copy. And you understand that you have the right to access it? Yes. Good. I'm also going to state for the record that the reporter is now being requested to provide a certification of the transcript, certifying it to be an accurate and true transcription of the record that we make here today. Finally, have you had a chance to review the letter dated the 23rd of March, 1978, from Acting Director Frank C. Carlucci to the chairman of this committee? Yes. Do you understand the letter? Yes. That is the same letter that you were shown in April. Is that correct? I thought the one I saw in April was signed by Turner. No, this is the same one. The same one. In any event, do you understand that this letter authorizes you to testify fully and truthfully before this committee to matters relevant to the committee's mandate? All right, so let me just preface a couple things that I'm catching already. So first off, she's saying, hey, I'm just concerned that my testimony is going to be in conflict with the records because everyone lies, right? And you never know what everyone else's lies is going to be. And then she wants to emphasize that it'd be through faulty memory alone, though, of course. And then when they ask her if you understand, in any event, do you give up your right to receive a transcript copy? Her answer isn't, yes, I give up my right. Her answer is, I don't need a copy. That is not her giving up her right to receiving a copy. And so if she ever decides later on that she wants a copy, what can she do? She can go, I never said that. I never said I didn't want a copy. She said, I don't need a copy. That is not the same thing as saying that you give up your right to receive a copy of the transcript. See what I'm saying? That's intentional. This is CIA training. What else was there? I'm also going to state for the record that the reporter is now being requested to provide a certification of the transcript, certifying it be an accurate and true transcript for the record that we make here today. Finally, you'll have a chance to review the letter dated March 23rd, 78 from Acting Director Frank Carlucci to the chairman of this committee. Yes. Do you understand that letter? Yes. That is the same letter that you were shown in April. And what does she say? Of course she knows that it is, because it is. And they're saying it is, and it is, right? So is she stupid? She not really know that? No, of course she knows that. But what does she say? I thought the one I saw in April was signed by Turner, right? So she leaves us just a hint of doubt, right? So if ever needed to be a question on whether or not she saw that same document, there can always be some doubt there. More CIA training. No, this is the same one. Same one. In any event, you understand this letter authorizes you to testify fully and truthfully before the committee to matters relevant to the committee's mandate. Remember, the CIA had an internal memo where they recognized that that they would lie under oath for national security reasons. Right? You can't believe a fucking word any CIA agent says under oath unless there's corroboration. Within the provisions of this House Resolution 222, yes, anything that is relevant to the committee's mandate, you'd be required to testify about truthfully and accurately. Do you understand that? Yes. Let me indicate for the record that this corresponds with JFK Exhibit number 94 that was used at the hearing of April 13th, 1978. Fine. Examination begins by Mr. Goldsmith. Miss Goodpasture, who was the chief of station in Mexico City in 1963? Winston M. Scott. Do you have any special working relationship with Mr. Scott while you were stationed in Mexico City? Yes. What was your personal relationship? What was your relationship? Was it a special working relationship? Well, I was responsible for the day-to-day handling of some projects that Mr. Scott had the major decisions on, and one of those projects was the redacted operations. The one that is of interest in this investigation. Which redacted project are you referring to? The telephone tapping operation. Did people in the Mexico City station and in headquarters, especially in those in Mexico City, consider you to be Win Scott's right-hand person? Well, no, I can't really answer that, and I don't think that there would have been any reason for anyone to have considered me as his deputy, which would be his right-hand person because he had a deputy then. I've been in Mexico longer than anyone else in the station except Mr. Scott, and for that reason, a lot of people came to me and asked me questions about things that had happened rather than going to their files and looking up the answer. I don't know how they looked upon my job there. I saw a memorandum in the files written by Mr. Shaw, in which he referred to me as Win Scott's secretary, who has been down there for a long time, but I never had that position. Now, as you know, Miss Goodpasture, the committee's investigation is focused on Mexico City in many ways, and in particular on the operations and workings of the Mexico City station. Let me ask you this. What was Mr. Scott's reputation for professional competence, integrity, and honesty? Well, reputation to me, I felt that he was honest. I had no reason ever to believe that he was dishonest. I think he had a PhD in history. He had extensive government service before he was sent there. He was assigned by the director, Mr. Dulles, at the time, over a number of people who had been in Latin American posts that they thought would leave that chief of station assignment. So there was no reason for me to ever doubt that he was highly qualified, in my opinion. Now, I cannot speak for how other people felt about him. In your personal working relationship with him, did you find him to be a very competent and honest man? Yes. The ambassador called on him almost every day. I think we went through 5 ambassadors during that time that I was there, and his relationship with all of them was the same. In 1963, was the Mexico City station the largest station in Latin America? I think Panama may have been the largest in size, but I believe Mexico City had the largest number of independent operations. Outside of Panama, I think it may have been the largest station, but Panama had the most people. And it was considered to be a very important station? I think so. I don't know how headquarters personnel considered it, but in my opinion it was. When did Mr. Scott retire, approximately? I came home in 68, and I think that he retired in June 69. Do you know why he retired? It was my understanding that he retired because he had been asked to stay in Mexico until December 1970. He had asked me to stay in Mexico until December 70 because I had been there for a long period of time, and it was easier to keep someone there than it was to break in a new person. In that time, the president was Diaz Ordaz, and his term expired in December of 1970. I wanted to return to the States because my parents were both not well, and I'd been outside the United States for the better part of some 28 years, and I wanted to be near them in their very old age. I also wanted to take advantage of early retirement at age 50 because I wanted to do something else with my life. Mr. Scott let me come back, and he came to the States later. I came home at the end of 68. He came to the States later on consultation or something that he had decided to retire because he received an administrative message saying that he was age 60 and he was eligible. That was mandatory retirement age, and he would have had a special authorization to remain longer. So he decided to quit because he felt he had already received that authorization and left in a tiff. So how would you describe his position towards the agency when he left? Well, at the time he left, I think he felt that he wanted to stay on in Mexico, that he was on good relations, as far as I know, with the director because he was given a medal and he came up to receive that. The agency also, I think, was considering using him in an undercover capacity outside. So although he was initially annoyed by having received this administrative notice, by the time he left the agency, he was favorably disposed towards it. Is that correct? I think so. I think he just decided, well, he would go ahead and retire while the present administration in Mexico was still there, and they could help him with his immigration papers, which took months to get under new administration. And it would be easier for him to get settled in, and if there was any question in Washington about whether they wanted him to stay or whether they did not, it really didn't matter. I don't know, but that is my feeling about what happened. After his retirement, Mr. Scott stayed in Mexico. In Mexico City? Is that true? Yes. Did Mr. Scott ever write any personal history describing his life as an intelligence officer? He never showed me anything. He showed me writings that he had done of the Soviet intelligence operations that was published in Reader's Digest, but he never went over any history with me about himself. So you don't know whether or not he wrote a personal history describing his life as an intelligence officer? No. He never discussed any such work with you. He never discussed it with me. I'm going to ask you to read at this time CIA number 4008 through 4016, and for the record, I will indicate that the agency has made available to the committee various materials which the agency has assigned numbers to for security purposes, and we are using the agency's security numbers to identify the materials that we are using here today. So I'm going to ask you to read at this time CIA number 4008 to 4016. Yes, I saw this draft back when I was here when I was working. What year? In April of 77, but this was never discussed with me. Mr. Scott had no knowledge of this if he wrote it. Let me identify this for the record. It is marked folder number 1, chapter 24, from draft manuscript of The Foul Foe, the book which purports to be a book of a writer's career in intelligence. The writer is Ian Maxwell, believed to be the pen name of Mr. Wynne Scott. Now, you testified that Mr. Scott was a competent individual and an honest man. Would you comment upon the accuracy of the contents of this manuscript? Well, to me, it appears that he was writing this for sales appeal, as far as I could tell. It does conflict with the records. I don't know, but I think that this may have been several years after he stopped working, or certainly a long time after the assassination occurred, or the investigation occurred, and maybe his memory was faulty. I don't know, but I think it conflicts with what we have. What sections of the manuscript conflict with the record? Let's go through it. Well, it leads one to believe that we had photographs here. He says that he is known to have visited both the Soviet embassy and the Cuban consulate. Well, we concluded from the conversations that he actually went to this Soviet embassy, but I didn't see any actual proof that he was in the Soviet embassy from the records. Now, one telephone call was made, as I remember, from the Cuban embassy, but I don't think he made a telephone call to the Soviet embassy. I may be wrong, but I don't think he did. That is one instance. What proof did you have that he went to the Cuban embassy or consulate? He made a call from inside the Cuban embassy, and we picked it up on the telephone tap line from the Cuban embassy. I should clarify that by saying a person whose voice was considered to be the same by the transcriber made the call, and the conversation in that call was in a continuity with a previous conversation in which he identified himself. Here's another place that I don't think can be checked out with the records. Persons watching these embassies photographed Oswald as he entered each one and clocked the time that he spent on his visits. As far as memory goes, we never photographed Oswald or identified a person as Oswald entering or leaving either place. I said we, the people, that I didn't see any information to that effect. Are there any other sections of that manuscript that you think are inaccurate? There may be. You have to take it sentence by sentence to check with the record, which I have done, but I point those two things out. Well, why don't you read through it again and point out any major inaccuracies in the manuscript? May I make a check mark on the side of this? Certainly. Paragraph 2 on the first page, that is 4009. So she's reading from sections of Win Scott's manuscript. I'm pretty sure this is readily available. If the guys in the chat can pull this, that'd be appreciated. Paragraph 2 on the first page, that is 4009. As my memory recalls it, when he made his first contact with the Soviet embassy, he did not say anything about Crimea. On page 2, at the end of paragraph 1, looks like something might be redacted there. I can't really tell. Or it might just be a break in the paragraph. And then the question is, this is page 4010. Use these numbers here. 4010, paragraph 1. I'm inclined to go along with the Warren Commission report on that because I believe that when we went back over the records after the assassination, we found the Cuban embassy, but I am not sure about that. So the section here where it states, quote, this contact became important after the Warren Commission report on the assassination of President Kennedy was published, for on page 777 of that report, the erroneous statement was made that it was not known that the Oswalds had visited the Cuban embassy until after the assassination. Every piece of information concerning Lee Harvey Oswald was reported immediately after it was received to the U.S. Ambassador Thomas Mann, etc. You're not certain whether this is accurate? I question it because I think what happened was that we picked up the name and asked for a file trace on the name. Please continue, and we'll get back to this other document that I have here. Page 4011, paragraph 1, the term, because we thought at first that Lee Harvey Oswald might be a dangerous potential defector from the USA. Quote, the way I remember it, we never had any idea who Oswald was at first, and it wasn't until 10 days later or sometime later when we received an answer to the file trace that we knew that he was a defector or that we ever thought about him being a defector. There was nothing that I saw in the first telephone contact that suggested that he was a defector. Please continue. Quote, and he was observed on all his visits to each of the two communism embassies. Now, as I remember it, that statement is not correct, not observed by our informants. Was he observed by any sorts? I didn't see any information that identified him in those conversations, as I remember, were not studied in detail until after we got the telegram identifying him and then the assassination. That period after the assassination, we went over those records so many times and made so many translations that it is hard to distinguish between the time after that defector cable was received and the assassination investigation. But after the defector cable was received, we did try to get all the information together. Let me show you at this time CIA document 243, which is a copy of an article dated 21 October 1964. And specifically, there is a paragraph in there that reads, quote, the investigators are trying to determine why the CIA in its pre-assassination reports to the State Department on Oswald's trip to Mexico City gave details only of the defector's visit to the Russian embassy and not the Cuban embassy. Did CIA not report the latter visit until after Kennedy's assassination in Dallas? The CIA did not report the latter visit until after the assassination. Please read that paragraph to yourself that I just read. Yes. Is that your handwriting in the margin on the right? Yes. What does that say? Quote, the call from the Cuban embassy was unidentified until headquarters sent traces on Oswald and the voices compared by Fineglass. He was a transcriber. That is what I said, I thought, but I could not remember whether it was after we got the cable from headquarters that we learned about the Cuban embassy or whether it was after the assassination. So now it appears that shortly after you received the cable from headquarters, the connection was made between Oswald and the Cuban embassy. I don't know whether someone took those transcripts to the transcriber and asked him if it was the same person, or if he may have had copies of that tape remaining at the time, but you would have to ask him about that. In any event, the connection was made between Oswald and Oswald's visit to the Cuban embassy before the assassination? Yes, according to this, it was. Fine, please continue. I could not remember whether it was after the cable or after the assassination. And now it appears that it was before the assassination. Before the assassination. Please continue with the manuscript. Page 4014, paragraph 2, I don't recall that Oswald spelled out his name slowly and carefully for the Soviets in the telephone transcript. Maybe I am wrong, but I don't think that was in there. Fine, please continue. That also has Crimea in there. I think he may have gotten that Crimea from another transcript, another call that was made by a transportation agency asking for requirements for a visa to Crimea. That was on the transcripts in between these calls. But we determined it was not connected with Oswald. Page 4015, paragraph 2, persons. To my knowledge, there were no persons who saw Oswald enter and leave each embassy and clock the time he spent there. Those are all comments that I can make. Thank you. Let me show you CIA number 183, which is the headquarters copy of the cable that was sent to Mexico City Station. I'm sorry, this is the Mexico City Station copy of that cable. You may recall that we have shown it to you before. This is the one that makes reference to Oswald as Lee Henry Oswald, and when Scott apparently drew an arrow and wrote down sick, underlined, pointing to the middle name Henry. Now the committee has received testimony that this notation was made prior to the assassination. And we have here, on the one hand, a manuscript where Scott says that Oswald spelled his name slowly and clearly. And we now hear Scott aware that apparently Oswald's middle name was not Henry. Does that suggest to you that perhaps there was a transcript where Oswald did spell his name slowly and clearly? Well, I don't think so, because I saw those transcripts before Mr. Scott did. The way the paperwork ran was that those transcripts were given to the outside contact who brought them to me. I looked at them, and in case of someone who was speaking in Russian or a language that the monitors could not transcribe at the listening post, that one copy of the transcript and the tape went immediately to the person handling the other transcriber. In the case of the Soviets, it would have been Mr. Redacted. Sometimes the outside person could take that tape to the transcriber, but I don't recall any instance when Mr. Scott saw the transcript before I did, and I don't think that he spelled his name slowly and carefully. That is not the way I remember it. So in summary, the sections of this manuscript that you have referred to as being in conflict, or let me see if I can clarify this, are you saying that they are inaccurate because of your memory, or you are saying they're inaccurate because they conflict with the record? Well, I think both. Okay. Part of the things that I worked on when I came up here in February of 77, I did not remember until I saw the files. That newspaper clipping I didn't remember at all until I saw it at the hearing. And essentially you're indicating that this manuscript prepared by Mr. Scott is exaggerated. In my opinion, it is. The only thing that we could compare it with is the record of events. Why would Mr. Scott have any reason to exaggerate these things? Pardon me? Why would Mr. Scott have any reason to exaggerate these matters? He had written books for sale, and I think that he probably felt that it would have more sales appeal. That is my guess. He had published a couple books. I don't know how many books he had published, but I received a flyer or two of books that he had published, and I didn't bother to read them. So in essence, then Mr. Scott, whom you have characterized to be an honest man, was not telling the truth when he read this first paragraph. No. Let me read it to you. Quote, "A great deal has been written about Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, much of which has appeared in print and was written by persons who knew nothing and who tried to conjure up from some mysterious sources materials which they hoped would sell. A great deal is written by people who knew a smattering and tried to design from what little they knew a story in which they hoped that what they said would eventually be taken as fact. I learned something of Lee Harvey Oswald in the period from Friday, September 27, 1963, when Lee Harvey Oswald, having just arrived in Mexico City, made his first contact with the Soviet embassy. Then it goes now in this first paragraph, Scott is trying to distinguish himself from all these other people who are trying to make money by conjuring up from mysterious circumstances, from mysterious source materials they hope would sell, and you're saying that despite that he's doing the same thing. That is the way it appears to me. Also, I'd like to say that during the time that I was there in my dealings with Mr. Scott, I felt that he was fair and honest with me. Now, there were times, too, when he exaggerated things that I knew were exaggerations. Could you give me an example? Yeah, I can give you an example. Suspect individuals that we had collected information on. There was a saying that went, here was a suspect Soviet agent when the person made their first contact with the Soviets. The second or third or fourth contact, they suddenly became known as Soviet agents because they had been there so many times. I felt that was an exaggeration, that they may have been going there to get propaganda, and I discussed those things with him. Did Mr. Scott maintain a personal safe? He maintained several personal safes, but I think he had 3 or 4. Where? He kept them in the office. Some of them had very sensitive coded materials in them that he had custody of, and he dealt directly with headquarters on. Some of those projects I worked on were not related to this investigation. He also had a personal safe in his home. What type of materials did he keep in that safe? Well, now I never inspected these materials in that safe at his home. I know that from time to time he took classified documents from the office home to work on them at night. I don't know whether he brought all the copies back with him. After he died at the time of his death, I went to a man who was then director of counterintelligence and told him that I thought there might be classified documents in his home. Some of those documents I was told were later turned over to station chief and sent back to Washington. Did Mr. Angleton personally go to Mexico City to retrieve those documents? Yes, he went there to the funeral, and I think he talked to redacted at that time, Mr. John Horton. After Mr. Scott's retirement, what would he have been doing having classified materials at that time? He had no business having them in any way of thinking. Now, the committee has received testimony or statements from agency employees. One, for example, was Mr. Redacted. Do you know him? Yes. What is your assessment of his competence and honesty? Well, when Mr. Watson and I were in Mexico together, he was working on projects that I was not related with. Then he was named deputy. I think shortly before I left, I liked him socially, but I didn't work with him. How extensive was the P file that the Mexico City station had on Lee Harvey Oswald? I would say they were voluminous. Are you referencing to only Oswald? Yes, or all of them. I'm referencing to Oswald's. There were several volumes. I'm not sure how many. Now, Mr. Redacted has testified that when he saw the Oswald P file, it was rather thin, and also that within the file he saw a photograph of Oswald that had been taken in Mexico City. I should correct that. He did not testify that he gave a statement to the committee investigators about that. That he saw a photograph of Oswald that had been taken in Mexico City? Yes. Well, I don't think that the Mexico City station ever made a photograph of Oswald. I think that he may have been referring to the unidentified man, but I don't know. As a matter of fact, he was shown the photograph of the unidentified man, and he said, no, that is not the one he remembered seeing. That's not the way I remember it. How familiar are you with the history of Mexico City Station? The agency history? Well, just the history in general of the Mexico City Station. Well, except for faults in my memory, I think I'm as familiar as anyone who served there. Have you ever prepared an account of the history of Mexico City Station? Yes. When did you do that? Yeah, I believe in 71, somewhere during that period. Why were you selected to prepare this history, do you know? I was never told. What was the purpose? I felt that someone who had a higher rank should have been selected. In fact, somebody who did have a higher rank was selected, a man who had outranked me, who had worked on the desk and had much broader knowledge of the Mexico operations than I had been selected. and he'd been on the payroll as a GS-15 for well over a year or longer, and he had not written a page of that history. Who was this man? His name was Brady, B-R-A-D-Y. I came back from Mexico, and they told me that I had to write it. I tried to cooperate in working on it. What was the purpose of writing this history? To satisfy headquarters requirements. Why does headquarters have this kind of requirement? That came down from the director's office. I don't know. When they asked you to prepare the history, with what goal in mind did they ask you to prepare it? Pardon me? When they asked you to prepare the history, they must have explained to you what the purpose they had in mind, why they wanted the history to be written. They didn't ask me to prepare it. I was ordered to prepare it, and it was from a headquarters director. When they ordered you to prepare the history, they must have told you what were important factors to consider in writing a history. Did they just ask you to write a history without giving any guidance at all? There was a historian who was brought in, I think from Michigan, one of the large universities, who had several general discussions about how to write history and how to coordinate material, but there was no one there immediately above me with any experience in research or in writing a history. I did it mostly on my own. And you do not know why these station histories are prepared? No, unless it was just to make it easy for briefing material for people who were going there. I would like to show you at this time CIA number 164 and ask you if you can identify this document. Yes. What is it? This is a background draft that I was asked to write when I came to work in Washington for the Inspector General's staff. They asked me to write down as much as I could remember or put together from the files, which they had what happened in Mexico, a resume. Now, I was told that this would not be used in any way except for a background information. It would never leave the agency. When was this? 10th of February, 1977. This is not the history of Mexico. I understand. The history was prepared in approximately 70 or 71. This document, I objected strenuously to it being used because I want to call attention to the names of people. Many of these people are still serving, some of them in very sensitive jobs, and they are not connected in any way with this investigation. No one is using those names, Miss Goodpasture. I know, but they were released outside the agency. That is a problem you have with the agency, yes? Now, I would like to ask you to read page 30 to 31 of your prior testimony, starting at the top of page 30 and going through line 16 on page 31. All right. Now, I would like to ask you to read CIA number 4090 to 4091. Before I do, Miss Goodpasture, do you remember giving this testimony in April? Yes. Please read that document. I didn't remember my precise answers, but I think they are still valid as far as my memory goes now. I don't think I have ever saw this before. Have you read both pages? Yes. That second page in the middle 60s there was a proposal to reorganize the station, and I was going to be given a job as executive officer or personal assistant to the chief of station to create a slot so that I would be given a promotion. My personnel file, perhaps over at headquarters, may reflect that, but it never came about. One of the reasons that I wanted to retire was that they talked about the job, but they never gave it to me. So in fact, you're saying that you were not special assistant to the chief of station, not in reality, except for those projects which I worked on and he made the decision on. What I mean by that was that he talked to the senior people involved, and I did the legal work and most of the paperwork. Is there any of your prior testimony on page 30 to 31 that I just showed you that you would like to modify in light of CIA number 4090 to 4091? No, because I think that they told me that they thought I was best qualified to write that, but I don't really know, except that I am sure that the other people did not want to do it because they didn't want to be sitting here talking to you and discussing it. There were many people who could have done it. The deputy chief of station knew more about it than I did. So when you wrote this document, you were doing it in anticipation of meeting with a congressional committee. Pardon me? So when you wrote this document, did you in anticipation of meeting with a congressional committee and having to respond to a congressional committee? Yes, because one of the first things I saw when I came back to work was the green book that the previous committee had prepared. In this statement in your prior testimony, true, Miss Goodpasture? Quoting your testimony, quote, I was told that all the people who were there at the time would be interviewed and would be asked to do the same thing that I was asked to do. Yes. So you were told that. I was told that, but if I remember it, I think Mr. Leader talked with everyone who had been there, and it was for that reason that I tried to make up a complete list here of all these people. And all those people would be asked to write a report as you were being asked to do. That was my understanding, yes. That they would be interviewed and write a report. And write a report or make a written preparation of their memory of the events at that time. How many months did you work on this project? Well, it was interrupted by my mother's sudden death. I think it was almost 3. And you felt the agency was going to have all these other people spend 3 months. Many of these people were still on the payroll, but the writing of it was only part of it. My main function up there, I felt, was to get the files together, to help locate the files and put them together for review by the Inspector General's staff when they were needed by the Congressional Committee. Did you know that you were preparing a report that would be used by the Inspector General? Yes, I sat in his office, in his deputy's office. Now, we've taken a great deal of testimony from various other agency employees, and I would like to ask you to comment about some of their testimony in which they characterize you specifically. Question by Mr. Goldsmith. Quote, was Ann Goodpasture acting in a supervisory capacity with regard to the redacted operations? Quote, Mr. White, that is very difficult to say. That is very difficult to say. She carried with her a lot of invisible authority that developed upon her because of her operational relationship with the chief of station, who had absolute confidence in her. She had a marvelous memory. She was meticulous in detail. I think she had every reason to put that kind of trust in her. That he had every reason to put that kind of trust in her. Quote, she reported directly to him, and while she may not have been invested with any command authority by virtue of her position at the station, certainly she was a kind of unofficial deputy for the purposes of the operations that she was involved in. Quote, for example, we had this old ex-FBI guy on the outside who worked with Redacted, the TAPS, and when Ann spoke to Redacted and said something to him, Redacted knew damn well it had been the backing of the chief of station, and if he didn't, he could go around and check it out. Quote, by and large, there was not much question in Redacted's mind that when Ann said, quote, the boss wants this, that it came from Wynn. To that extent, she had supervisory responsibility. Mr. Goldsmith says, was Ann Goodpasture an employee of the station? Redacted said she was. Goldsmith asks, what were her station responsibilities? Mr. Redacted said she had many responsibilities that included being an assistant to the chief of station. She was also a person who had some type of responsibility for collecting the photos that we obtained in the Soviet embassy activities, and I think she was also involved to some extent in the telephone tap operations we conducted against facilities in Mexico City. Mr. Goldsmith says, to your knowledge, was Ann Goodpasture Wynn Scott's right-hand person? Mr. Redacted said, yes, she was. Mr. Goldsmith says, he asks, do you know what her responsibilities, referring to Ann Goodpasture's, were in Mexico City Station? Well, this one's not redacted. It says, Mr. Skelso. She was a sort of personal assistant to Wynn Scott. Mr. Goldsmith, who were Mr. Scott's chief deputies? Quote, let me rephrase the question. Upon which individuals did he tend to rely the most? Quote, Mr. Shaw, he had one deputy who was Alan White. As far as reliance on other people, I would say he relied very heavily on Ann Goodpasture. Not in any way in a command function, but as a girl Friday. Miss Goodpasture, I would rather be a girl Friday than a right-hand man. And then everybody laughs. Well, I made more of those statements as those people saw it in their relationship with Mr. Scott's projects. They are true the way they saw it, but I had no responsibility outside the projects that we worked on. But the redacted projects and the telephone tapping projects touched every operation in the Mexico station. By Mr. Goldsmith. Question, did you have any contact with... And the answer was, I just didn't think I was important as other people seemed to imply that I was. Prior to testifying before this committee in April, had you had any contact with anyone from the agency, from the CIA, regarding your testimony here? No. Well, yes, I had contact. I had a call from Russell Holmes, who told me that he could not locate some photographs and he wanted me to come up before I testified, that I would have to testify. Mr. Leader told me that I would have to testify. When I came in, I thought I would be seeing someone for an interview. In the corridor, I saw Mr. Redacted, and he asked me what I was doing here, and I said I was going to talk to him. He said, we all had to talk to them, but don't worry because they're only going to ask you about some of the details that are down there in the records. He was the only one that had already talked to you. The others had their dates set up or something. I don't remember precisely what dates. Did Mr. Redacted discuss with you the substance of the questions that were asked of him? He said generally they wanted to know about what happened down there and the things you will know the answers to in the photographs. I don't recall anything specific in any specific questions. After your testimony in April, did you have contact with anyone from the agency about that testimony? I had contact with several people who asked me what I said. I didn't discuss that testimony with anyone I recall over here. I discussed this document with the Inspector General's office because he had told me that it was for background information only. I said, I wanted to know why you released that document instead of the official record copy. And he said he did not release it. It had not been released. Then I said, well, you better discuss it with them. I didn't discuss it with any of the others. I saw Mr. White in a cocktail bar, and he asked me about it. I told him that I thought he would be called to testify, and I was not at liberty to discuss the questions that you asked. Did anyone else ask you about the questions that you were asked? I don't think so. Did Mr. Breckenridge or his staff? I went to Mr. Breckenridge. He's the one I talked to about these documents because I felt that you didn't have all the files. Did you discuss the substance of your testimony with Mr. Breckenridge? No, I discussed the documents generally, but we did not go into individual questions. Then I told him that I didn't think I made a very good impression and that it was a pleasant experience. Was anyone there with whom you discussed the subject of your testimony? No, Mr. Leader, Mr. Breckenridge, and Russ Holmes were in that meeting. So I think I might have said when I went into Mr. Holmes' office that it was really rough or something like that, but we didn't get into many details. Have you had any contact with the agency prior to your testimony? Yes, I came in Tuesday, called you from the edge of town. When I arrived at my friend's home, she said, someone's trying to call you. His name is George somebody. The name didn't mean anything to me. The next morning, a man who identified himself as George Joannitas called to tell me that you had been trying to get in touch with me, and I told him that I had already talked with you and explained to him that I had called your office before I left Dallas and I had to go to a family funeral. He said that's all I wanted to know, and I had no other discussions with him. After your testimony in April, did you stay in Washington or in Virginia and do any work for the agency? In April, I went to the agency the following day and talked to Mr. Breckenridge and Mr. Leader, Mr. Holmes. I don't think I went back to the agency again. So you didn't do any work for them? No. No research work, for example? No. When I came up before I talked with you, I helped them locate the photographs. Some of the photographs they could not find, but that was before I came over here. I would like to ask you to read pages 14 to 16, line 13 on page 16 of your prior testimony. Yes, I haven't had any breakfast yet. We can stop for a recess at any time you like. And in fact, we will stop at lunchtime, 12 noon, at which time you can get to enjoy the Capitol Hill food again. I don't think you were very pleased with our cafeterias last time. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to stop right here. We will pick this up tomorrow. This is the testimony of Ann Goodpasture in late 1978, all having to do with Mexico City, operations in Mexico City, and potentially Oswald's involvement down there. But of course, we know it wasn't Oswald down there. It was Kerry Thornley. So that's going to do it for today, guys. I will be back tomorrow. And thank you for tuning in.